The Life of Saint Jerome by Father Largent. Chapter 2. The Desert of Chalices. Jerome, however, had left Aquileia, not for Antioch, but bound for the wilderness. He plunged into the heart of the desert of Chalices, where, under burning skies and amid vast tracts of sand, out of which sprang here and there a few scattered convents, he had gone to seek repentance, and where he found fresh sorrows awaiting him. Heliodorus returned to the west, and Jerome's friendship for Innocent and Hylas was ruthlessly severed by their death. But the memories of his libertine youth, which troubled the peace of his soul and threatened to sully a chastity so dearly bought, caused him a still keener grief than the loss of his friends, and he has left us a description of his anguish, of his almost desperate but finally victorious struggles, in pages of striking eloquence and immortal beauty. How often, he wrote, buried in this vast wilderness, scorched by the rays of the sun, have I imagined myself in the midst of the pleasures of Rome. I sat alone, because my heart was filled with exceeding bitterness. My limbs were covered with unsightly sackcloth, and my blackened skin gave me the appearance of an Ethiopian. I wept and groaned daily, and if in spite of my struggles sleep overcame me, the bones in my emaciated body, which sank to the naked earth, barely clave together. I do not mention my nourishment or drink, for in this desert even the sick monks scarcely dared touch fresh water, and to eat cooked food would be considered an excess. And I, who though the fear of hell had condemned myself to this prison, inhabited by scorpions and serpents, imagined myself transported into the midst of the dances of the young Roman maidens. My face was pallid with fasting, my body cold as ice, yet my soul burned with sensual emotion, and in flesh already dead, only the flare of my passions was still capable of kindling. Debarred from all help, I threw myself at the feet of Jesus, watered them with my tears, wiped them with my hair, and strove to subdue my rebellious flesh by weeks of abstinence. I do not blush to own to my misery. Rather do I weep that I am no longer as I once was. I remember having often spent the entire day and night in crying aloud, and in beating my breast until at the command of God, who rules the tempest, peace crept back into my soul. I even dreaded my cell as if it had been an accomplice to my thoughts. Angry with myself, I penetrated alone, further into the desert, and if I discovered any dark valley, any rugged mountain, any rock of difficult access, it was a spot I fixed upon to pray in, and to make into a prison for my wretched body. God is witness that sometimes, after having long fixed my eyes upon heaven, and after copious weeping, I believe myself transported among the choir of angels. Then, in a trusting and joyful ecstasy, I sang unto the Lord, with pursue thee by the scent of thy perfumes. In order to subdue his flesh and curb his imagination, Jerome had recourse to other means besides corporal punishment. When I was young, he wrote, although buried in the desert, I could not conquer my burning passions and ardent nature, and in spite of my body being exhausted by perpetual fasts, my brain was on fire with evil thoughts. Finally, as a last resource, I put myself under tutelage of a certain monk, a Jew who had become a Christian, and, forsaking the ingenious precepts of a Quintilian, the floods of eloquence poured forth by Sirico, and the grave utterances of Phronico, and the tender words of Pliny, I began to learn the Hebrew alphabet, and to study this language of hissing and harsh-sounding words. I, who have suffered so much, and with me those who at this time shared my life, can alone testify to the efforts I wasted, the difficulties I went through, and how often I despairingly interrupted my studies, which a dogged determination to learn made me afterwards resume. And I give thanks unto God that from such a bitter sowing I am now able to gather such sweet food. It was probably at this period, that is, in 374, that the mysterious dream of which Jerome had left us a dramatic account came to him. Imbued with the works of classic antiquity, he cherished a love for them. Miserable wretch, he wrote. I fasted before reading Sirico, after nights spent in vigil, after tears wrung from me by the memory of my sins. I would take up Plaunus, and when on coming to my senses, I read the prophets. Their speech seemed to me uncouth and unfinished. Blind, I blamed the light instead of condemning my own eyes. A vision cured him, for a while at least, of this passion. Towards the middle of Lent, probably the Lent of 375, while Satan was thus mocking me, I was seized with a fever which, finding my body exhausted by want of rest, consumed it to such an extent that my bones barely clave together. My body was becoming cold. A faint remnant of warmth, however, still enabled my heart to beat. They were preparing for my funeral obsequies, when suddenly my soul was caught up from me and carried before the tribunal of the Supreme Judge. The light was so dazzling, those who surrounded him shed such a blaze of splendor, that falling back upon the ground I dared not gaze aloft. They asked me who I was, and I answered, a Christian. Thou liest, said the judge. Thou art a Ciceronian, and not a Christian. For where thy treasure is, is thy heart also. I was silent, and whilst the blows rained down upon me, for the judge had commanded that I should be scourged, suffering even more from the torment of my bitter remorse, I repeated to myself this verse of the Psalms. Who will render thee glory in hell? Then I cried out weeping, have pity on me, Lord, have pity. This cry rang out in the midst of the blows, and at last those who were present, throwing themselves at the feet of the judge, entreated him to have mercy upon my youth, to grant me my time to work out my repentance, and to punish me severely if I should again pursue a pagan book. I, who to escape from the terrible streets in which I found myself, would have promised far more, swore to him and said, calling his name to witness, Lord, if I hereafter I harbor or read any secular books, may I be treated as if I had renounced thee. After this oath, I was released and I returned to earth. Those present were astonished to see me reopen my eyes, which were bathed in such a flood of tears that my grief conceived the most skeptical, that it was not one of those vain dreams by which we are deceived. I attest the tribunal before which I lay prostrate, and the sentence which so appalled me. Please God that I may never again be submitted to such an ordeal. When I awoke, my shoulders were bruised, and I could still feel the blows. From that moment, I studied religious books with far more ardor than I have ever read profane ones. Did Jerome abide by this oath throughout his life? Although making allowances for the saints' vigorous memory, to which reminiscences of Terence, Lucerius, Cicero, Virgil, and Seneca were continually recurring, Augustine at Hippo preserved the memory of his classical education in the same tenacious manner. We have reason to believe that Jerome more than once opened the works of those pagan authors whom he had renounced. To Rufinus, whose insidious hatred accused him of the crime of perjury, he replied that the keeping of a promise made in a dream could not be extricated of him. However, even if Jerome did not deem himself irrevocably bound by this pledge, he applied himself more and more to the study of the Bible, and his classical reading and recollections were exclusively devoted to defending and embellishing the truths. This is what he pointed out in the celebrated letter to Magnus, the orator, in which, with skillful and weighty arguments, he cited the example of all his predecessors, reminding him that according to Deuteronomy, the Israelite must needs cut the nails and hair of his slave before marrying her. Is it astonishing that profane literature should have seduced me by the grace of its language and by the beauty of its form, or that I should wish to convert a slave and a captive in the daughter of Israel? If I come across anything dead, any passage breathing idolatry, sensuality, error, or evil passions, I suppress it, and from my alliance with a stainless spouse are both servants of the true God. Thus do I increase the family of Christ. The questions of discipline and dogma, which were agitating the Church of Antioch, disturbed Jerome afresh in his retreat. 4 bishops were contending for the patriarchal see of the East. In 361, after the death of Eutychus, the intrepid champion of the Nicene faith, the Arians and many Catholics had agreed to elect Meletius of Sebaste, whose orthodoxy, already attested at the time of Constantino's persecution, asserted itself at Antioch from the very first, with the result of alienating the Arians, who chose Azoius as their leader. Those Catholics, however, who were the most devoted to Aethinius' glorious memory, refused to give their support to a bishop who had counted Arians among his electors. Toward the end of 379, Lucifer of Caligari, on his return from the exile to which he had been banished by the son of Constantine, appointed the priest Paulinus, who was recognized by Alexandria in the west as bishop to the Eutychians. At the beginning of 376, to support his heresy in introducing the bishop of Laodicea into Antioch, Apollinarius had the audacity to assign the government of this great church to his disciple Vitalis, whom he had consecrated. Quite outside of all this, the inhabitants of Antioch and of the monasteries at Chalcis were discussing whether they should recognize in God three hypostates, or three persons. In the theological language of today, the two terms are synonymous, but in the 4th century they were not considered so by all. At Antioch, the Meletians used the word hypostasis in preference to the word person, a form which Salabirus had not refuted. The Parasitans of Paulinus, on the other hand, confirming themselves to the Latin custom, which understood hypostasis and substance to be synonymous, considered it an Arian impiety to say that God there were three hypostases. Urged by the monks amongst whom he lived to pronounce upon the legitimate vicar and the orthodox expression, Jerome addressed himself in 2 famous letters to the Pope Damasus. Certainly, these letters are sufficient proof that he disliked the word hypostasis, which seemed to him equivocal of erroneous. Meletius, too, the champion of this word, was especially displeasing to him, and his sympathies were entirely drawn towards Paulinus, the patriarch favored by Latin Christianity. Upon these points, he asked the judgment of the Roman pontiff, which he valued above everything, and to which he was willing to submit. I thought, he wrote to Damasus, that I ought to consult the Apostolic See and the Roman faith, which St. Paul the Apostle extolled. I crave spiritual nourishment from the church where I received the baptismal robe. You are the light of the word, the salt of the earth. In your possession are the vessels of silver and gold. Elsewhere are the vessels of clay and of wood, destined for the iron rod which shall shatter them, and for the internal fires which shall consume them. In terms which succeeding centuries have freely quoted, Jerome proclaimed that Roman preeminence and the obligation imposed upon all to conform to it. I know that on that stone the church was built. He who eats of the paschal lamb outside of its walls is an impious man. He who has not sought refuge in the ark of Noah will be overtaken by the deluge. He then asked Damasus to inform him which vicar he was to follow, and which term he was to employ. I do not know Vitalis, I repudio Meletius, and I ignore Paulinus. Whoever reaps not with thee, scatters. Whoever belongs not to Christ belongs to Antichrist. It is evident that Jerome could not accept the term hypostasis with enthusiasm. He declared as much in bitter, almost haughty tones. Nevertheless, he was willing to accept it should Damasus pronounce its usage to be legitimate. I pray you decide this matter for me, and I will not shrink from saying that there are three hypostasises in God. I implore your holiness by the crucified Lord, by the consubstantial Trinity, to write and authorize me to either suppress or use this word. Jerome of Chalcis, probably deriving from the desert by some foolish persecution, and joined Evagrius in Antioch, where Paulinus compelled him to enter the priesthood. But so strong was his love of solitude, so jealous was he of his liberty, that he stipulated that his ordination should not bind him to any one particular church. By a peculiarity the Jansenists willingly proposed as a model, Jerome never ascended to the altar. In virtue of this liberty, which was justly dear to him, he contended in the dialogue written at Antioch against the heterodox rigorism of Lucifer of Caligari, the bishop who had consecrated his friend Polonius. Towards 380, we made the indefatigable traveler at Constantinople, where St. Gregory of Nazianzus, placed against his will upon the episcopal throne of that town, was re-establishing the true faith in the hearts of the people, who for 40 years have been given over to an Arianism, and with poetic and touching eloquence was disturbing the treasures of his irreproachable doctrine among them. It was to the tuition of such a master that Jerome submitted himself, and in after years he took pleasure in evoking his reminiscences of him and in repeating his lessons. He also knew that, at that time, another doctor of the Church, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Basil's brother, who read him his refutation of Eunomius and of Anomianism, the audacious and radical form of the Arian error. Eunomius and his adherents represented, in fact, the left wing of Arianism, and as has already been said, they extricated the latent rationalism from this heresy. The name of Anomian, which they had adopted, was a protest not only against the Catholics, who proclaimed the Son to be of the same substance as the Father, but also against the semi-Arians, who declared the substance of the Son to be like that of the Father. This name signified that, according to their idea, the Son was neither equal to nor like the Father. Thus was God leading the future interpreter of the Scriptures to the purest and most abundant fountain heads of Catholic teaching, and placing him amongst men to whom heresy was familiar, and who excelled in confuting it. He was about to bring him into the very heart of truth, for Gregory of Nazianzus, disheartened by the weakness and ingratitude of men, and anxious to return to his solitude of Arezine, had at the Council of 381 abdicated his episcopacy. There being now nothing further to detain Jerome at Constantinople, he started for Rome, where the council which Pope Damasus had convoked seemed to call back into the church of his baptism. This Dalmatian, ripened by age, penance, and study, and especially fitted to give to the supreme authority information regarding the disciplinarian and dogmatic controversies then agitating the patriarchate of Antioch. On his way, Jerome, according to Berenius, must have passed through Greece, and it is to this period, that is toward the year 382, that we must ascribe a journey of which we have but few details. It is strange, it has been said, that of our saints should not have told us more of a country in which it is impossible to walk a step without awakening a host of memories. Did he fear that his journey was in some way an occult sacrifice to his admiration for the antique, a secret homage to the pagan spirit, whose influence he seemed so much to dread, or did he recall the words of his revered master? This master, Gregory Nazianzen, so Greek in his genius and in his language, certainly seems to have harbored against Athens, which he feasted upon the masterpieces of antiquity, the same feeling of anxious distrust, with many centuries later, Manning experienced about the Oxford of his youth. Let us say in short, without more circumlocutions, that Jerome, wedded through he was to Greek literature, was not in his turn of mind one of those baptized sons of Hellas, who under the neophyte's robe, or even under that of the priest or pontiff, remain ever faithful to the revealer of so much beauty, and are always ready to turn towards it gratefully, and almost tenderly. Jerome would never have exclaimed, as if Finland at the beginning of his career in the letter to Bosset, full of lively and charming spontaneity, interspersed with reminiscences and aspirations of the most varied description. I am about to start. I verily nearly fly. The whole of Greece lies open before me. The Sultan draws back in alarm. Already the Peloponnesians breathes in liberty, and the Corinthian church bursts into new life. The voice of the apostle shall once more be heard within it. I feel myself transported into those lovely spots, those precious ruins, and collecting there not only the most curious monuments, but at the very spirit of antiquity itself. I seek the Areopagus, where Paul proclaimed the unknown God to the wise men of the world. But after the sacred comes the profane, and I did not disdain to pause at Pyretius, where Socrates planned his republic. I ascend the double summit of Parnassus. I pluck the laurels of Delphi, and I taste the delights of Tempe. It is not in this manner that Jerome speaks of Corinth, although he praises its literary taste, cultivated by its proximity to Attica, or even of Athens. If he mentions this town, which according to a famous saying is the very Greece of Greece, it was merely to say that he had seen near the statue of Minerva a brazen spear so heavy that he could scarcely move it. I asked, he adds, what was the use of the spear? And they answered that it served to test the strength of the athletes, and that no one could enter the arena without having lifted this weight, thereby showing which antagonist he was fitted to encounter. In another commentary, he alludes to the Athenian Autor, whose mysterious subscription suggested such a persuasive exordium to St. Paul. The inscription, said Jerome, did not run to the unknown God, but to the gods of Asia and Africa, to the unknown and foreign gods. As Paul only needed to mention one unknown God, he employed the singular when he informed the Athenians that this God designated in the inscription of their altar was his own, and when he enabled them henceforward to know and worthily honor the God whom they could not ignore and whom they unconsciously worshipped. This statement, if correct, for Pausanias, the geographer, quotes a similar inscription to that mentioned by St. Paul, is an example of how ingeniously, if someone who unscrupulously, this apostle, who excited such a keen interest in Jerome, as indeed he still does in us, profited by every opportunity that lay within his reach. Thank you for joining me again on this second chapter, third audiobook that I have recorded. I hope all of you have a blessed day, and I hope to see you in the next audiobook. God bless you all.